That's actually one of the reasons that most companies say, the ones that don't do performance testing, say that they don't do it because they don't have a performance testing environment. And my answer is always, yeah, you do. It's called production.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 162, Performance Testing with K6. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. As application developers, the one thing that we love more than writing code is writing tests. Do you agree, Victor?
Actually, I do. You probably expected me to say no. I do, but I feel that I'm an exception rather than a rule. I have really hard time convincing colleagues and friends and people I know or don't know that, hey, writing tests is a good thing. I like it. People don't.
Yeah, you just said it right there. People don't enjoy it, but you're not a people. So it sort of fixes the conversation there.
Fair enough.
But one of the specific tests that I actually do enjoy writing because I can usually break things is load testing. And today we have on Nicole from K6. Nicole, how are you doing today?
Hello, everyone. Doing well. It's bright and sunny here in Maastricht in the Netherlands.
Don't repeat that word. It hurts my ears.
Bright and sunny.
No. That what I guess was a town.
Maastricht.
Or something like that. Yeah. I don't know how you people do it. I mean, that's just hurtful.
It was just the name means the crossing where the river Maas crosses.
Still, the way how it's pronounced is not really appealing.
I love it.
What we're doing right now is we're load testing this episode, so let's not do that. Nicole, why don't you explain what K6 is? Because surprisingly, a lot of people still haven't heard of K6, but people are aware of its predecessors, if you will.
Yeah, sure. K6 is two things. One, it is an open source tool, so you can use it completely free, and most people use it as that. But there is also a SaaS platform around the same tool that turns it from just a tool into like a full way to do distributed load testing. And I think that the reason why it isn't maybe in the limelight as much as other tools is because it's a little bit too much on the modern side, because we're doing this really weird thing where we appeal to developers. Primarily testers as well, but I think it is a little bit unusual for a testing tool to try and appeal specifically to developers. That kind of segues into what you were talking about, that many developers don't like testing. I'm happy to hear that Victor is not one of them.
Maybe another reason for not being as widely appealing or known is that you happen not to write it in Scala.
Yeah, I would think that would be a bonus, no? Our scripts are written in this weird language that nobody's heard of called JavaScript.
Is that a plus or a minus? I'm not sure.
Personally, I think it's a plus. I think it's way more ubiquitous than most other languages that, I mean, I don't know why, but traditionally testing tools have done this thing where they think it's cool to create some sort of proprietary language and use that in their scripts. Like, it's like we're trying to alienate developers who already know these languages.
And trust me, I worked with Scala. I brought a lot of code in Scala. Scala at the time was great. Now I don't know whether it exists. But Scala is not a type of language where you just jump into and say, "Hey, I know I'm not working with Scala, but I'm willing to write tests in Scala." That was very painful. Not for me, I worked with Scala, but for people I tried to convince to use it. Wait, what is the name of the tool? I forgot now. My brain stopped.
Gatling?
I remember Scala. Gatling. Yeah, Gatling. What a nightmare.
Well, it's still a good tool.
It is, but it's funny how when I look at the tools, and I'm now not talking about testing only, but in general, if I look at the tools that I used in the past, and I was very happy with those tools at that time, now when I look at them, it's kind of, oh, how could I have done it, right? And it's not Gatling only, right? But many, many tools from the past. It's over time they become not good, I guess, because time changes and the way how we think about things, the way how we operate things changes with those times. And it's very hard for tools from the past to adapt to those times. So sometimes you have something new, like K6.
Yeah, so I know when I first got into performance testing, my first tool was actually Neoload, which is still around, but I heavily did testing using LoadRunner, which now is owned by Micro Focus. Before that, it was HP, and before that, it was Mercury. But those are tools that are very monolithic. They're like big proprietary applications that kind of do a lot of different things, right? But it is, and they're still both around today and still used to great success, still great tools, but it does require a certain mind frame to use it. After that came the shift towards open source, and things like JMeter came up. But the problem with that is that it is showing its age now. I think it's about 20 years old or something now. And it was also on the one virtual user to one thread paradigm, which quickly shows its limits because that's just a very dated way of doing it. And the more we move our applications online, and the more people are able to access them, the higher the number of virtual users, or the higher the load that we need to simulate is. And then things like Gatling came along, which improved significantly on JMeter, because even though it's still on Java, they're employing some really pretty cool things to break that one virtual user is to one thread paradigm. But the problem is that it's still on Java, right? With all of the issues that comes with, all the performance issues, and also having to tune the JVM as a separate layer. I came from that world, and I still use those tools. I still am updated on the latest developments in those. But the reason that I was attracted to K6 is that it rewrites it completely. The language is a bit of a compromise. K6 is written in Go, which I really love. All the best things are written in Go these days. It's definitely one of the more modern languages, and all of the stuff out of the CNCF incubation, it's all Go. And so it capitalizes on that, and yet it makes a compromise that the scripts are written in JavaScript, which I think is good for developers and testers.
Why do you say that?
From my perspective, I think that there's always been, from the beginning, there's this idea that teams have to be siloed, that there have to be developers on one end, testers on the other, there's a wall in the middle, and you have to pass things back and forth. That's the traditional way of how things worked. It's definitely, we're trying to move away from that as an industry, and some teams have done it successfully, but that's definitely where I came from. And my struggle was how to involve developers, because I never thought that it had to be solely the job of a tester to run tests. I mean, you're telling me that developers can't, for some reason, get into the attitude of a tester? That doesn't really make sense. There are a lot of synergies. Testers can code and developers can test. And I think right now I've met a lot of developers where they might know they might specialize in two languages, and one of them is always JavaScript because it's everywhere. It's if especially if you're a front end developer, it's very easy to get those developers to write tests if it's in a language that they already know. And from a testing perspective, I had already been using JavaScript because tools like Selenium or Playwright or Puppeteer already use JavaScript. So it wasn't a language I specifically had to learn for K6.
And it's not really that much about, at least I feel like it's not really that much about learning for K6, because even if you haven't worked with JavaScript, you're not doing complex computation. I mean, K6 might be behind the scenes doing complex things, but it's not that you're writing algorithms as tests and then you need really to know a language inside out. Like, hey, is this construct faster than that construct and stuff like that, right? And somebody who knows how to program shouldn't have a difficulty switching to a new language if what needs to be written is not complicated, right?
Yeah, I think it's not so much a case of can people learn it, because I think anybody can learn it. Anyone can learn to program, but it's also about inclusivity. Why would you purposely choose a language that very few people know, or create your own language just so people can write tests in your language? Especially when you're an open source tool, it kind of defeats the point, right? You want to have it out there and have it be freely available for everybody else. And the language is a huge step that it can be a huge barrier. It's weird to think of an open source tool that then puts up an arbitrary barrier as a language just because why exactly? You don't think that any of the languages that are out there are good enough? Seems not feasible.
Yeah. I mean, that's in line with the direction where we moved since 10 years ago or 20 years ago. You were mentioning those big monolithic tools, right? And the problem with those tools was always that you need to dedicate yourself to that tool even to reach the level of Hello World, right? You know, those big IBM-like type of frameworks, platforms, whatever it is, that require special training to use it, right? And we are not there anymore. At least I feel that we are not there. You have a complexity that you might need to have 20 tools instead of one tool, but jumping into a tool today should, in majority of cases, be fast, right?
I think that the way that testing tools have evolved really mimics the way that applications have evolved in general. Before, what people wanted, what companies wanted too, was like an all-in-one kind of one-stop shop. You have something that'll do your test management, like have test cases there, something that runs it, something that analyzes it, all of the notifications set up. You just want to install one executable or something and then have everything be there. But now people want choices. People want to choose the best in class for every little function. And so our testing tools have to be like that as well. They have to be modular. They have to work with everything. They can't just work with proprietary software. That way you can actually incorporate it into whatever Frankenstein CI/CD pipeline you come up with.
Yeah, that's very similar to the logic that I feel many are using, including your parent company, Grafana, right? Typically, if you would go 20 years back in time, a company like Grafana would have one monitoring or something like that tool, right? But now we're talking about Prometheus, and then you need to combine it with Grafana. You should combine it with Loki for, right? Breaking into smaller pieces that you can combine any way you like. And that's CNCF landscape in a way, right?
I have to admit, when we were told that we had been acquired, my heart sank and I thought, oh no, what is going to happen? But I must admit, it's been pretty good with Grafana so far. And a lot of that is to do with this big tent philosophy that they've got. And it's not just marketing jargon. If you look at the Grafana site, they also have things on how to use, Prometheus with New Relic, or just, they're not just Grafana everything. And even at K6, we have instructions on how to use K6 with Dynatrace or New Relic or Grafana as well, or you can use InfluxDB if you want. There's a variety of different tools. That's how it should be. We should focus more on getting the job done and not necessarily the tools that we're using. They don't all have to be Grafana branded. If they're not going to do the job, then what are you doing? The tools, if they're good enough, should just recede into the background and just make it easier for you to actually do your job.
Yes, I would combine that with the ability to adopt something, right? Because if I have a company and I'm looking into, let's say, improving logging, to say something, right? I might not be willing to replace my whole system for the sake of that, right? I want to be able to plug something as a replacement for my outdated logging without replacing everything else, right? So in my head, the main advantage of having more focused, smaller tools is that I can unplug something and plug something else instead of shutting everything down and saying, okay, completely new platform. Let's stop doing what we're doing for a couple of years and then we will be up and running again. Or never change, which is a more likely outcome, right?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the benefits of it. And we've seen that even big players, big companies sometimes go down, have very public, very long outages. That's why, Amazon or Google or YouTube can't do anything, can't have any sort of outage without everybody knowing about it. And having different tools on different providers and different platforms and different frameworks also makes your system a little bit more reliable, although a bit more complex as well. It's always a trade-off.
What if I already have a bunch of tests written in JMeter or fill in the blank, and I wanted to test out K6? Is there an easy way to do that?
We do have a converter. We don't really shout it out from the rooftops because it's kind of difficult to recommend it. It's two different languages. So yes, it might work for some cases, but honestly, I'd say if you already have, hundreds of test scripts in JMeter, think about why you are trying to move. Because maybe you don't have to. Not everybody has to change everything if it's already working. If you are seeing some of the pain from maybe collaborating on JMeter scripts, then maybe look into K6. I think that the best way to do it and the most long-term way to do it is to just write the scripts from scratch, because you'll find that there are some things that will change when you're writing in JavaScript versus writing in a primarily UI-driven testing tool like JMeter. Some things are just not going to translate.
So the converter's a best effort. If it works, great. If it doesn't, great as well. And you really should probably end up refactoring it regardless if you're going to K6 from fill-in-the-blank tool.
Yeah, I think it's unrealistic not to expect or not to allow for any refactoring. There's definitely going to be some of that, whether you're tweaking scripts that were generated by the converter or if you're just doing it from scratch on your own.
Now, K6 is open source, and there's also a cloud plan. So you have open source, runs fully local, I guess is how I could say it. But then you can also, quote unquote, scale it, I guess, to the cloud. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, K6, the OSS tool, is pretty much like a do-it-yourself kind of plan. You take it and then you have the burden or the fun of building something on your own, and like building a test framework. If you want to do distributed load testing, that is something that you'll have to do yourself. We have some tools for that. Like if you want to do it on Kubernetes, we have the K6 operator, for instance. There are ways to do it, but you will be responsible for providing the infrastructure and making sure that everything from the commit, if you're trying to build it into a CI/CD pipeline, you're going to be responsible for the entire process from the commit to like actually having usable results. But K6 Cloud is like a way to skip all of that pain. If you just want to try K6, for instance, or don't really have your own infrastructure or your own cloud provider account, K6 Cloud is like the way to get started quickly. So you run on our AWS account. So it kind of smoothens out that process if you just want to get going. We also have a test builder, which is like a graphical way to create tests. It's not the same as doing it just scripting it on a text editor. And it's certainly not as fully featured, but it kind of gives you a taste of how to run a test.
Well, that was going to be one of my next questions is how long does it take for me to get to Hello World?
Not long at all. If you either on K6 Cloud or on OSS. I mean, maybe OSS, if you're a developer and you're already used to JavaScript, it might be easier to start with that way because if you're on a Mac, it's just brew install K6, for instance, using Homebrew, and it'll install in seconds. After that, you write a single HTTP GET request and you're off to the races.
So once I write that GET request, what am I expecting? I mean, if you've brought out JMeter and, oh my goodness, you even brought out LoadRunner. That's been a very decades old product. What should I expect from the output from K6? I mean, I think about those other tools and it's like, okay, big charts, big graphs, but what does K6 offer in the way of sort of that visualization?
Out of the box, it'll have none of the visualization and all of the data because we find that not many people are looking for their visualization and analysis tool to be tied up into your load testing tool, because the problem with things like LoadRunner is that it generates its own results dashboard, but it's going to be unlike the dashboard or the report for any other tool. So again, if you're trying to invest time and effort into learning, into your team learning a tool that's going to be usable going forward, then that's not really the best way to do it because it's still tied into the tool. So if you replace LoadRunner, then how are you going to get those results? It's going to be completely different. And so K6 doesn't come with graphs by default. There are extensions that you can use so that you can get a nice real-time dashboard. You can hook it up with Prometheus and Grafana, so it's more extensible on that front. But if you're just running K6 without anything, you will get a bunch of metrics on response time, very, very low-level metrics as well, not just the duration of how long it took for the request to get back to K6, for the response to get back to K6, but also like how much time was spent connecting and handshaking, and you can get as granular as you want.
As someone that's been in the performance testing space for years, and again, you said LoadRunner, so by you saying that, I know you've been around it for quite a while. What do you see happening in the next 5 to 10 years? Is AI going to start playing into this at all?
I think it's already starting. And it's right now, what we're seeing from it is probably the GitHub Copilot stuff, which affects K6 in an unexpected way, just because K6 scripts are written in such a way that because they are load tests as code, they are affected by Copilot. And there's also somebody who wrote a whole blog post about it and has made presentations who's not from K6, but he's using Copilot as like a kind of wizard to write K6 scripts if you're not used to it, because there's a lot that you can do just by typing out what you want to do in a comment, and then Copilot kind of auto-completes the rest of it. That's just the beginning, and it's definitely not perfect, right? But I do think that AI is going to come more into play. For example, one of the things that I always hate with load testing tools is after you run a test, it's like, what now? You don't know what to do like running the test is one thing, but analyzing it is another. And so one of the awesome things about K6 Cloud is performance insights, where it says things like, oh, all of your requests returned HTTP 200 status codes, which is great, but the load generator itself was reaching 90% CPU utilization. That's a warning sign, and it's a warning sign that maybe someone who's new to load testing wouldn't necessarily know to look out for. So instead of just bombarding the people with data, we need smarts about how to interpret it. And there are a lot of things that tools should be smart enough to detect and highlight. And it's like, what happens next? What do you do next? Well, if your CPU utilization was too high, you need to monitor it more so that you know when a test is invalidated, because high CPU or memory utilization can invalidate a test, especially if it's on the part of the load generator. Your entire test might not be reporting accurate response times because the bottleneck is on the load generator side, not even in the application server. So I'm hoping that we see more progress on that front. I want to be able to run a load test, or not just me, like I want someone who knows nothing about load tests to be able to run a test and have them see exactly what the load test results are saying in human terms and what to do next. Like, here's this problem. What else can you do to troubleshoot that or to figure out how to move forward?
It would be nice also to get some kind of comparison, meaning that if you're a newbie, then, okay, so on average, your response time is 0.5 seconds, right? Is that fast? Is that slow? I might not know that, right? And it would be really cool to get that type of information. Hey, actually, according to the average industry standard, you're doing great, or you're doing horrible, right? Or something like that. Maybe comparison with others in a way.
Yeah, that's actually on the cards that we're talking about that now. Don't hold us to this or like ask for a date or something, but that's where we want performance insights to go, because we even like what Lighthouse does in DevTools. If you run Lighthouse, it already gives you scores for different sections, and because it's Google, they compare it to the average site. I mean, you have to take those scores with a grain of salt, right? But they could still be useful depending on your scenario or your reason for doing the testing. But yes, that's definitely something we want to get into. And even without looking at industry standards, we're getting to the point now where we can look at our own database and say, well, 80% of the companies that ran tests with us had this response time or something. But then you get into privacy questions. So that's why we're trying to think of using some third-party data instead.
I want to go back to that 90% CPU statement you made. What is the magic number or range of number for a load testing agent to actually be running at? What is its happy idle?
The rule of thumb that I give is 80%, but it also matters. It's not absolute, right? It's not as if as soon as you cross that threshold, it's like, it's okay, now it's not okay. It's not like that. You also have to look at the distribution. But that if people want a number, I do say 80%. And the reason that it isn't quite that clear cut is, for example, if utilization spikes in the beginning of a test but then tapers back down, well, that might be to be expected because the load generator is now just, well, firstly downloading all of your scripts and test data and fetching the latest image of K6. And, there is some increased utilization that you can expect at the beginning of a test. If there's a random spike in the middle of the test, is it going to invalidate the entire test? Not necessarily. It's good to figure out what was happening then, but it might not invalidate all of the test. But if it's like hitting 100% for the majority of the test, that's a problem. Yeah, because it means that the load generator is slowing down enough that maybe it's just not registering that the server responded several seconds ago. That's what you don't want to have happen, is that the act of measuring, it's kind of like in quantum physics, right? When the act of observing sometimes changes the results. You want it to fade into the background as much as possible. And the reason that the way that you proceed from that is to either make your scripts a little bit less spiky. So you might introduce think time, for example, if that makes sense in the scenario you're trying to simulate. Or you could think about distributing your load test so that you still get the same amount of load, but maybe from 2 generators instead of 1.
How would you split it to 2 generators?
So if you have 1,000 virtual users that you want to test with, for example, and you're finding that with 1 load generator, it's not enough, or it seems to be struggling, it's going above that 80% utilization, then you could do 500 in one and 500 in another. In K6 Cloud, this is as easy as selecting another availability zone.
Which, in reality, if you've got a globally based application, you probably want to split application zones or availability zones anyway.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And it's funny because K6 OSS on its own, it's capable of producing a large amount of load. Like, depending on your machine, of course, it could be up to 40,000 users. The reality is I probably wouldn't recommend you to test with 40,000 users from a single load generator. At that level of load, it's probably some publicly accessible endpoint, right? And if that's the case, then can you be 100% sure that all of your traffic is going to come from the same location that your load generator happens to be based in? It's probably going to be distributed across different availability zones, even if it's in the same country. But you might also consider distributing globally too.
What size machine supports 40,000 users? That just seems like insane.
I'm not entirely sure what that benchmark was done on. I believe it was M52X large on AWS. I'm not. I'd have to double check that.
So not like super large. Okay.
No.
I was thinking that, okay, great. This is going to be like 128 cores, a terabyte of RAM, right? And all SSD type level of stuff. How important is disk when I'm running my tests? Because obviously I need to be able to get the tests off disks and load it up and to process them. But if I'm also tracking, I'm assuming there's logs that are happening throughout. How important is that disk underneath K6?
Ideally, if you've set up your test correctly or according to best practices, it shouldn't matter too much, because I think that the best practice would be to try and avoid writing to logs unless you absolutely need it. So the time to have very verbose logs is while you're troubleshooting a script. When you're not even sure if it works to begin with, then by all means run a single user and log everything if you'd like until you've built up enough confidence that your script actually works. But then when you're actually running a ramped up load test, I wouldn't turn logs on for everything. Maybe some errors, and also be judicious on that. Like, do you need all of the HTML that's returned or something? Or do you just need to count? Like, yep, that was an error on this URL. So yeah, definitely logs come into play. But also from the test data perspective, we've run across some customers who had issues because they had very large CSV files with like thousands of user accounts that they wanted to test. And it was getting to be a problem because all of the test data files by default used to be transferred onto every instance. So it was like a lot of work for no real reason. So we came up with the idea of shared arrays, which is kind of like sharding the data so that only the line that a virtual user needs is sent to that user. So you're not just randomly, arbitrarily uploading several megabytes of data for no reason, even when it's the same data.
So it sounds like that data set gets loaded up in a single place, and as the VUs run, it gets its little piece of data that it needs for that run. Is that
Yeah,
oversimplifying
exactly.
it? Okay.
No, that's basically how it works. And another way around it is to use libraries like Faker to generate random data on the fly.
Okay, let's talk about Faker and its variants. Is data from tools like that really what we want in our tests?
Depends on the test. For some tests, you just want something that's maybe unique. And in that case, then maybe it's enough. There are some other tests, though, where you need to be able to verify it in the sense that instead of just randomly having whatever name, you want an identity. And there are services for that, completely like not related or affiliated in any way to us, is a tool that I've heard of called testdataservices.com.au, and it's made by a performance engineer in Australia. And there's a free version and a paid version, and what it is basically a database of identities. So it's not randomly generated data. It is an identity that has a name, an address, a BSN, which is like a business number for Australia, like Medicare numbers or whatever. It's a whole list of information, and you can corroborate that information later. So it's not just generated on the fly, and then we don't really care about whether the right strings were attached to the right person. These are for services like Test Data Services are more for when you need data that's consistent every time. And they also have things like maybe you have an application that sends an email to confirm sign up or something. Everything is it's an endpoint. So you just are able to use it in your load tests kind of like you would for any other HTTP request.
We talked about what could be the largest, the 40K users, which still to me would be insane. What's the smallest device I could run K6 on to where it would still be useful?
That would be interesting. I am not sure. That could be an interesting experiment. Like, I'm pretty sure that somebody would have tried running it like on a Raspberry Pi or something.
I mean, it seems like a Raspberry Pi, even an older version of it. Now, you're not going to get a whole lot of VUs, but if I'm only needing to run a single VU, maybe it's just a drip that's always running, right? Because we're talking about performance testing, but one niche, in my opinion, of performance testing is ongoing testing. It's not that you're trying to hammer it. It's more that because if I can have that same test that I'm doing at performance always running underneath, that's just a different idea of performance. Is everything staying consistent or not?
Yeah, and it all comes down to the misconception that people think performance testing equals load testing, which is totally not true. A performance test doesn't have to be thousands of users that are hammering a system with the goal of simulating peak load or trying to get it to fail or get to a breaking point. A performance test can be one user or a handful of users. And kind of like what we were saying, a single test doesn't really encapsulate everything that you're going to need to know about an application's performance. In fact, it might be better to tie in those performance tests to some pipeline so that it runs more consistently and you can start to see trends rather than just a snapshot.
That's especially true if you're running it against production, right? Because if you want to see whether your system is responsive, you do not need to hammer it, right? Because your real users are already hammering it. One or couple or maybe 10 VUs should be enough for you to know, hey, is it operational? Is it responding fast? You have real users over there.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons that most companies say, the ones that don't do performance testing, say that they don't do it because they don't have a performance testing environment. And my answer is always, yeah, you do. It's called production. Now, should you run the same kinds of performance tests? No. Of course, with every environment, you have to assess the risks, right? And you do have to be more careful with production, but you can absolutely run performance tests in production. And really, every company is going to have a production environment, and you're still going to get very valuable data. It's actually a very efficient way to do it. Like you said, if your users are already hammering the system, it's kind of cool that you can run one user and get all the benefits of having run, the 40,000 users, for example, that you would have had to simulate in pre-prod.
I would go as far as correct you slightly. You say, yes, you can run it in production. I would say that if you can choose only one place to run it, that should be production. To me, it's more important actually to know whether production works than whether not production is production ready, right?
Totally agree. I think we lose sight of the fact that that's actually the goal. We're not trying to tune pre-production environments or staging. We're trying to tune production eventually.
And that's the part I think where I like how it is unopinionated in a way that you can hook it into different sources or destinations, like Prometheus, for example, because going back to the beginning of the conversation, if I have production, I'm monitoring my production and I'm using Prometheus or maybe something else, doesn't matter, right? It makes perfect sense for me to have that as destination where performance testing data is stored, right? Because one of the things that I felt always awkward is, hey, this is how we monitor production, and this is how we monitor, to say something, tests running in staging environment. And those are the same things. I mean, not exactly the same things, but monitoring production and exploring the results of performance testing is very similar, if not the same. It makes perfect sense to use the same tools.
Yeah, or at least it should be like that, right? Because a lot of the disparity, like sometimes if you run a test on a pre-production environment, then run it on production, the results are different. And there are many reasons why it could be different, but one of those potential reasons is that maybe you didn't accurately predict your workload model, because when you run in a pre-production environment, you're not just responsible for generating the load, you're responsible for it being realistic. That's not something you have to worry about in production because it already is realistic. You're more interested in the measurement of it. But in pre-prod, things like your workload model or the shape of your load or, the delays between pages that your script goes through, those things make a huge difference in your test results. So in a way, it's like a shortcut. So I absolutely agree. If you can only test on one environment, let it be production.
And this is the part where people's brains blew and they left, kind of. Production is not touchable. Nobody can touch production.
I think that's a more old-fashioned way to think about it. I think there's a lot of benefit to looking at production now, but I still think that there are still benefits to having tests run in pre-prod. You can be way more destructive.
Well, it's good to be able to be destructive safely, but there's also times where you might want to be destructive in prod. But everybody's awake, and it's not during, if it's a retail shop, not during Black Friday or Cyber Monday, until you're ready to do it on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, because that's the super goal, I would say, is I want to be able to run these tests at scale no matter when, because then you can have trust that your systems are working as expected beyond even really bad environment situations.
Yeah, I agree. And there are also some companies with use cases where they can't really have a test environment. Like Netflix might have small test environments, right? But they can't really have a replica of the global infrastructure that they have in production. It would be, it's amazing what they're already doing, and how do they get around that? Well, they use principles from chaos engineering. They start small, they keep the blast radius small, and then they just increase it until something breaks. But they never start out with a goal of like taking everything down, right? You can't do that in production. Or you shouldn't, maybe.
Imagine that conversation with the tester, let's say. Hey, you just actually doubled the costs of our infrastructure so that you can run a few tests, kind of. You doubled production in Netflix for testing purposes. That would probably be your last day over there.
Yeah. And it's a case of jumping to like the biggest, most expensive solution out there when you could have proven that having a smaller environment might have already yielded, and testing on it might have already yielded some very valuable performance insights. Like there are performance improvements that you can make without necessarily having the entire global network just on your fingertips, ready to spin up at your command.
So if people wanted to learn more about K6, Nicole, where do they need to go?
You can go to k6.io and read the documentation there. Our docs are actually pretty good. They're written mostly by developers. And yes, they don't have dark mode. I'm sorry. But we are working on it. We are considering it, as funny as that is. But you can also look up K6 under Grafana, the Grafana repository or organization in GitHub.
And all of Nicole's contact information will be down in the show notes. Nicole, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was great to have a chat with you both.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.